Undercover CEO orders coffee at his own cafe, stopping dead in his tracks when he hears 3 words uttered by the waitress. What if the most successful businessman in the city had never truly seen his own employees until the day he decided to disguise himself as a regular Joe? Robert Harrison was the proud owner of 43 thriving coffee shops spread across 3 states. But on this particularly drab Tuesday morning, he found himself standing just outside the flagship cafe, sporting a wrinkled old jacket and a baseball cap pulled low, practically obscuring his eyes. At 46 years old, Robert had built an impressive empire from a humble single shop that his grandmother had lovingly left him. Yet, he couldn't for the life of him remember the last time he'd actually taken a moment to sit down and order a simple cup of coffee like any other ordinary customer. Through the large window, he observed a kind-faced woman with gentle eyes and graying brown hair neatly tied back in a simple ponytail. She moved effortlessly between the tables with the easy grace of someone who had dedicated years to serving others. Something about her naturally gentle manner gave him pause, making him stop and think. He'd definitely seen her name listed on countless payroll reports. Joyce Martinez, 38 years old, a loyal employee for 4 years with the company. But he'd never really noticed her, not truly noticed her before. As he reached for the door handle, Robert had absolutely no idea that 3 seemingly insignificant words were about to completely change everything he thought he knew about what it meant to be successful. "Where are you watching from tonight?" The morning rush had gradually settled into a comfortable hum of regular customers when Robert hesitantly stepped inside. The rich, inviting aroma of freshly ground coffee beans mingled perfectly with the soft, comforting chatter of neighbors happily catching up over their daily cups of joe. He'd specifically designed these spaces to feel incredibly warm and welcoming. But sitting here now, simply as another face in the crowd, he began to notice subtle details that had somehow escaped his attention during his usual hurried business visits. The worn spot on the aged wooden floor where countless pairs of feet had walked and stood. The charming way the sunlight painted soft golden squares across the mismatched collection of tables. His decorator had once proudly described the look as charmingly eclectic. Joyce approached his corner table with a genuine smile that radiated warmth and reached all the way to her kind eyes. "Good morning. What can I get started for you today?" Her voice carried a gentle warmth that had the uncanny ability to make complete strangers feel like long-lost, old friends. Robert found himself studying her face intently, noticing the delicate laugh lines that gracefully spoke of someone who found pure joy in the small, everyday moments, and the tired shadows gently under her eyes that hinted at long, tiring days and potentially even longer, sleepless nights. "Just a regular coffee, please. Black." Robert intentionally kept his voice lower than usual, feeling grateful for the baseball cap that effectively shadowed his recognizable features. He'd carefully practiced this very moment, worried that someone might unexpectedly recognize him. But Joyce simply nodded in acknowledgement and then headed towards the counter. While she efficiently prepared his simple order, Robert quietly observed the easy, almost choreographed rhythm of the morning shift. Tom, the young and energetic barista with the bright, infectious smile, enthusiastically called out the drink orders with genuine excitement. Betty, who must have been nearing retirement age, carefully wiped down the tables with slow, methodical care, always pausing to chat warmly with an elderly gentleman who seemed to be a daily regular. This wasn't the ruthlessly efficient, profit-driven machine that he often imagined when he reviewed the quarterly reports. This felt more like a cozy gathering place, a small, tight-knit community existing peacefully within the much larger city. Joyce returned to his table with his coffee, setting it down with careful attention to perfectly placing the handle just right for him. "There you go. Is there anything else I can get you? A pastry, maybe?" Betty baked her famous blueberry muffins this morning, and they're still wonderfully warm. Robert shook his head gently, then surprised himself by asking, "Have you worked here long?" "For years now," Joyce said, her eyes noticeably brightening. "Started right after my husband passed away. Needed something to keep me busy, you know. Coffee shops are definitely good for that. There's always someone who needs a kind word with their morning brew." She paused thoughtfully, glancing around the bustling cafe. "I love it here. Mr. Harrison, that's our owner. He doesn't come around much, but he's built something truly special. People feel right at home here." The casual mention of his name sent an unexpected jolt of complex emotions straight through Robert's chest. Here was a loyal employee genuinely speaking about him with sincere appreciation. Someone whose life he'd unknowingly affected without ever knowing her personal story. The stark realization that Joyce had tragically lost her husband, that this humble job represented far more than just a regular paycheck for her, made him suddenly see the cold, calculated numbers on his spreadsheets completely differently. As the peaceful morning gradually progressed, Robert found himself strangely drawn into the subtle drama of everyday cafe life. He attentively watched Joyce handle a particularly frustrated customer with such incredible patience and grace that the visibly angry man eventually left with a sincere smile and a heartfelt apology. He saw Tom go noticeably out of his way to remember a regular customer's complicated, custom order, earning a grateful pat on the shoulder from the appreciative older woman. Betty happily shared heartwarming stories about her beloved grandchildren while cheerfully refilling coffee cups, effortlessly turning a routine service into a genuine human connection. But Robert also began to notice certain things that deeply troubled him. The old coffee machine made an awful grinding noise that strongly suggested it desperately needed some much-needed repair. Joyce's well-worn shoes were noticeably thin, a small detail that quietly spoke of someone diligently making do with exactly what they had. During a brief lull, he overheard Tom quietly asking Joyce if she could possibly cover part of his shift next week, because his unreliable second job had unexpectedly changed his set schedule. These weren't the key metrics that Robert routinely tracked in his monthly business reports. Customer satisfaction surveys simply didn't capture the deeply personal way Joyce accurately remembered exactly how Mrs. Patterson liked her delicate tea or how Tom thoughtfully always asked about people's extended families. The detailed financial statements proudly showed healthy profits, but they completely failed to reveal that his dedicated employees were actively juggling multiple jobs and consistently making significant personal sacrifices in order to provide the palpable warmth and genuine care that ultimately made his bustling cafes so successful. When Joyce generously brought him a free refill, something he'd never actually explicitly authorized, but apparently happened regularly, Robert suddenly realized that he was actually seeing his thriving business through entirely different eyes. The generous gestures, the extra time willingly spent with lonely customers, the naturally kind way his exceptional staff treated each and every person who walked through the welcoming door like they genuinely mattered. None of this crucially important information ever showed up in his carefully analyzed profit margins. "You seem deep in thought," Joyce observed gently as she carefully topped off his cup. "Everything all right?" Robert sincerely looked up at her concerned expression and immediately felt something fundamentally shift inside his chest. This strong woman, who truly had every valid reason to simply focus on her own significant struggles, was genuinely worried about a stranger sitting alone in a coffee shop. "Just thinking about how we sometimes completely miss what's right in front of us," he said quietly. Joyce thoughtfully nodded with genuine understanding. "My late husband used to always say that. He'd tell me to really look for the good in ordinary moments because that's precisely where the real treasure is always hidden." She smiled softly. He was right about most things. As she gracefully walked away to help another eager customer, Robert leaned back in his chair, the full weight of his profound discovery settling heavily over him. He'd undeniably built a successful business, but he'd somehow completely missed the very heart of what truly made it actually work. The incredibly important question that began rapidly forming in his suddenly open mind wasn't simply about cold profits or mindless expansion. It was actually about whether he truly understood the wonderful people who actually made his success ultimately possible, and whether he was genuinely doing right by each and every one of them. The afternoon brought a noticeably different energy to the bustling cafe. Robert had originally intended to simply stay for an hour, maybe even two, but he found himself inexplicably reluctant to leave this invaluable window into his very own company. He discreetly moved to a quiet table near the back where he could diligently observe without directly drawing unnecessary attention, and what he gradually saw was beginning to fundamentally reshape absolutely everything he thought he definitively knew about effective leadership. Around 2 p.m., a visibly young mother entered the bustling cafe with a crying toddler and a newborn baby in a large stroller. She looked utterly exhausted, the kind of bone-deep tiredness that inevitably comes from long, sleepless nights and endless demands. As she struggled mightily to simultaneously manage both young children while also trying to place a complicated order, Joyce suddenly appeared right at her side like a literal angel of much-needed mercy. "Here, honey. Let me help you with that," Joyce said kindly, effortlessly lifting the fussy toddler while the grateful mother placed her extensive order. "What's your name, sweetheart?" she gently asked the little boy, who immediately stopped crying and looked up at her with naturally curious eyes. "This is Jake," the mother said gratefully. "He's definitely having a rough day." "We both are, actually." Joyce's simple response stopped Robert cold. She didn't simply take the customer's order and quickly move on. Instead, she patiently spent a full 10 minutes helping the struggling young mother find a comfortable spot, thoughtfully brought over some tasty crackers for Jake to enjoy, and even carefully held the peacefully sleeping baby while the visibly exhausted woman finally had a much-deserved chance to drink her now lukewarm coffee in relative peace. When the grateful mother sincerely tried to pay for the items, Joyce quietly mentioned that the kids' drinks were thankfully on the house. Another previously unapproved policy Robert had never personally authorized, but apparently happened regularly without his direct knowledge. The touching scene stirred something incredibly deep in Robert's distant memory. His own beloved grandmother, who had originally started the now-thriving Café, used to always do exactly the very same thing. She had genuinely believed that a warm coffee shop should always be a safe sanctuary for absolutely anyone who desperately needed one, whether they were happily celebrating a milestone or quietly struggling with a personal tragedy. Somewhere along the way, as he'd blindly focused solely on aggressive growth and ever-increasing profits, he'd sadly lost sight of that incredibly important founding principle. But Joyce clearly wasn't finished completely surprising him. As the long afternoon slowly wore on, he attentively watched her discreetly slip an extra pastry into an elderly man's bag when she thought absolutely no one was actively looking. She generously spent her valuable break time carefully listening to a troubled teenager who seemed particularly upset about something, offering comforting tissues and genuinely gentle words of sincere support. When another customer's credit card was unfortunately declined, Joyce simply said kindly, "Don't worry about it today. We'll definitely catch you next time," and personally paid for the much-needed coffee herself. Each seemingly insignificant act of genuine kindness was undeniably small, almost practically invisible, but collectively they skillfully painted a deeply meaningful picture of someone who truly understood that her chosen job was inevitably about so much more than simply serving hot coffee. Joyce was actively creating authentic moments of much-needed grace in other people's everyday lives, and she was readily doing it with her own limited resources because she genuinely believed it was the absolutely right thing to do. Robert found himself constantly thinking deeply about his very own life. His lavish corner office impressively located 40 floors high above the bustling city. The incredibly detailed reports that coldly reduced actual human beings to mere numbers and abstract statistics. When was the absolute last time he'd actually had a genuine conversation with someone who truly didn't actively want something directly from him? When had he last sincerely noticed if someone was specifically having a really bad day and simply needed a kind, supportive word? The stark realization hit him like a strong, physical blow. He'd become so blindly focused on rapidly building his impressive empire that he'd completely forgotten to actually build genuine relationships with the dedicated people who undeniably made it all possible. His loyal employees weren't just completely replaceable names on a boring payroll. They were uniquely complex individuals with their own personal struggles and deeply held dreams. And many of them, just like Joyce, were consistently going noticeably above and beyond every single day in order to faithfully uphold the core values he'd personally stopped actively practicing himself. As closing time slowly approached, Robert inadvertently overheard a specific conversation that made his own chest suddenly tighten with complicated emotion. Joyce was quietly talking with Tom near the ancient coffee machine, and her naturally gentle voice carried a subtle note of deep worry. "I don't know if I can realistically pick up those extra shifts next week," she was quietly saying. "My mom's been truly having a particularly rough time ever since her recent hip surgery, and I honestly hate leaving her all alone too much." Tom thoughtfully nodded sympathetically. "I could certainly ask Betty if she's interested in the available hours." She casually mentioned needing some extra money for her grandson's expensive school clothes. "That's definitely sweet of you to think of her," Joyce thoughtfully replied. "We all actively look out for each other here, don't we? It's like Mr. Harrison thoughtfully created this special place where people actually genuinely care about one another. The painfully obvious irony certainly wasn't actively lost on Robert. His most loyal employees were thoughtfully crediting him with actively creating a warm, caring environment while he silently sat there realizing that he'd honestly had almost nothing directly to do with the genuinely special culture they'd independently built among themselves. They were earnestly living out the important values he'd sadly forgotten, actively showing simple kindness he'd personally stopped practicing, and readily supporting each other in tangible ways that honestly never appeared anywhere in his detailed management reports. If this truly moving moment deeply touched your own heart, please generously give the video a quick thumbs up. Meaningful stories just like this quietly remind us what critically matters the most in everyday life. As Joyce thoughtfully began cleaning the numerous tables for closing, Robert intuitively knew that he simply couldn't realistically leave without somehow honestly addressing what he'd just genuinely witnessed. But he also intuitively knew that instantly revealing his true identity right now would inevitably change absolutely everything, possibly destroying the very authentic glimpse he'd been so unexpectedly given into his dedicated employees' true feelings and very real daily struggles. The deeply important question steadily weighing heavily on his suddenly clear mind wasn't simply about complex business anymore. It was fundamentally about what kind of decent person he ultimately wanted to be, and whether it was honestly too late to finally become the very leader his incredibly loyal employees actually deserved. The unexpected weight of Robert's life-altering discovery thoroughly followed him all the long way home. That quiet evening, settling sadly over his extravagant penthouse apartment like a suffocating heavy fog, he stood silently at his expensive floor-to-ceiling windows, passively looking down at the twinkling city lights, but instead of honestly feeling the usual satisfying sense of proudly surveying his impressive domain, he suddenly felt strangely hollow and empty. The excessive luxury surrounding him instantly seemed like elaborate props in a meaningless play he'd unknowingly been routinely performing for an empty audience of only one. He simply couldn't stop constantly thinking about Joyce's visibly worn shoes and naturally generous spirit, about the simple way she'd quietly paid for a complete stranger's much-needed coffee with what was undoubtedly her own limited tip money. The deeply uncomfortable contrast between her very authentic kindness and his own distant management style thoroughly haunted him through a long, completely sleepless night. The very next morning, Robert found himself quietly back at the bustling café, this time sincerely arriving even earlier than before. He'd immediately told himself that he simply needed to quickly gather even more potentially useful information, but truthfully he was inevitably drawn back by something considerably deeper. Watching Joyce and her dedicated colleagues had undeniably reminded him of a potentially better version of himself he'd actively forgotten. Someone who'd once wholeheartedly believed that true success realistically meant so much more than simply accumulating fleeting wealth. Joyce happily greeted him with the same disarming warm smile as the previous day. "Back again. I'm sincerely glad. That certainly means we're consistently doing something right." Her genuine pleasure at unexpectedly seeing a returning customer made Robert's own throat suddenly tighten with unfamiliar emotion. As he deliberately settled into his usual familiar corner table, Robert immediately noticed certain small details that had unfortunately escaped his close attention yesterday. The frequently used tip jar by the cash register was noticeably nearly empty, but Joyce and Tom consistently continued to faithfully serve each and every customer with unwavering enthusiasm and genuine smiles. Betty was quietly working despite an obviously bad cold, politely refusing to call in even slightly sick because she intuitively knew they'd inevitably be critically short-staffed. The busy morning inevitably brought a significant crisis that would specifically test absolutely everything Robert thought he definitively knew about truly effective leadership. Around 10 a.m., a noticeably well-dressed man in his mid-50s stormed angrily through the always-open door, his flushed face noticeably red with simmering anger. Robert immediately recognized him on sight. Charles Mitchell, the fairly new regional manager Robert had personally hired only 6 short months ago. "Where's Joyce Martinez?" Mitchell loudly demanded, suddenly causing nearly every conversation throughout the entire cozy cafe to quickly stop. Joyce emerged calmly from directly behind the bustling counter, her usual peaceful composure remarkably steady despite the obvious palpable tension suddenly in the familiar air. "I'm Joyce. How can I specifically help you, Mr. Mitchell?" We urgently need to talk right now. Mitchell's naturally harsh tone was clearly threatening. I've been quietly reviewing the very latest numbers, and there are some serious, potentially illegal discrepancies in your register reports. Money that really should be there clearly isn't. Robert quietly watched Joyce's smiling face visibly go subtly pale, but she steadfastly maintained her obvious dignity. I'm sincerely not sure what you actually mean. I honestly always carefully count my entire register carefully at the close of each shift. Well, apparently honestly not carefully enough, Mitchell quickly snapped. Head office is honestly concerned about potential theft, and your assigned register is unfortunately consistently short. We're immediately going to need to urgently discuss your specific employment status. The entire cozy cafe had undeniably gone completely silent. Robert could intimately see the stark shock and deep hurt silently reflected in Joyce's kind eyes. The subtle way her delicate hands trembled slightly as she instinctively processed the deeply serious accusation. He thoughtfully thought about all the simple acts of genuine kindness he'd personally witnessed, the free drinks for struggling customers, the extra pastries secretly slipped into bags, the numerous times Joyce had quietly covered small shortfalls with her very own money. Full understanding suddenly hit him like a bright lightning bolt. The mysteriously missing money clearly wasn't active theft. It was pure generosity. Joyce had been quietly absorbing the real cost of her natural compassion, thoughtfully giving away valuable items and quietly covering unavoidable expenses because she genuinely believed deeply in actively treating every person with simple kindness. Tom nervously stepped forward. His typically young face quickly flushed with protective anger. Mr. Mitchell, Joyce is honestly the most trustworthy person I genuinely know. If money is legitimately missing, there absolutely has to be another logical explanation. Stay honestly out of this, Mitchell harshly warned. This directly between Joyce and management. Betty immediately joined Tom's side, her typically grandmotherly demeanor suddenly replaced by uncharacteristic fierce loyalty. That honest girl has never actively taken so much as a single sugar packet that admittedly wasn't entirely hers. If you genuinely want to publicly accuse someone of active stealing, you absolutely better readily have solid proof. The intense scene actively unfolding directly before Robert's very own eyes was certainly more than simply a routine employment dispute. It was a profound moment that would ultimately define exactly what kind of company he'd actually built and precisely what kind of undeniably decent man he ultimately was. Joyce's naturally gentle voice was surprisingly quiet but remarkably steady when she deliberately spoke. Mr. Mitchell, I've honestly never stolen absolutely anything in my entire life. If there's unfortunately money actively missing, I can definitely explain each and every transaction. Sometimes I sincerely help customers who are unfortunately short on loose change, and sometimes I quietly give away a hot drink or two to certain people who desperately need them. I always honestly intended to speak directly to Mr. Harrison about specifically making it official company policy. But I simply never genuinely wanted absolutely anyone to go unfortunately without desperately needed coffee simply because they regrettably couldn't realistically afford it. That's honestly exactly the inherent problem, Mitchell curtly replied coldly. You're simply not expressly authorized to readily give away valuable merchandise. It's blatant theft, extremely plain and undeniably simple. Robert suddenly felt something break violently open deep within his chest. Not readily quantifiable pain, but a surprisingly strong barrier that had seemingly been silently holding back long years of unknowingly suppressed emotion. Here was Joyce, warmly explaining with admirable quiet dignity exactly how she'd been silently living out his own beloved grandmother's timeless values while he'd tragically forgotten they even remotely existed. She was understandably willing to honestly lose her invaluable job rather than denying her own small acts of simple kindness. The truly defining moment inevitably crystallized absolutely everything. Robert had actually been quietly struggling to specifically understand the undeniable importance of truly effective leadership, about honestly quantifying real success, about finally understanding what it meaningfully meant to actively build something truly worthwhile. He could readily sit silently here in deliberate disguise and passively watch a genuinely good woman be potentially destroyed by a broken system he'd carelessly created, or he could actively find the hidden courage to remember exactly who he'd honestly intended to be all along. Have you ever personally faced something truly similar to this experience? Please feel free to honestly let us readily know in the honest comments thoughtfully below. Sometimes the undeniably hardest moments willingly teach us the absolute most about exactly what we personally value the most. As Mitchell coldly prepared to enthusiastically deliver what was sadly going to be Joyce's almost certain termination, Robert finally made a key decision that would immediately change not just his long-struggling business, but also his entire life. The truly important question honestly wasn't really about whether he could actively afford to realistically lose a seasoned regional manager just like Mitchell. The far more important question was undoubtedly about whether he could honestly afford to actually lose his own soul. Robert abruptly stood straight up so quickly that his heavy chair unexpectedly scraped loudly against the worn wooden floor, the jarring sound immediately cutting sharply through the thick tense silence like a razor-sharp knife. Every set of inquisitive eyes in the entire buzzing cafe turned expectantly toward him as he deliberately removed his concealing baseball cap and straightened up slowly to his full height. The dramatic moment of complete recognition suddenly rippled noticeably through the still room like a heavy stone unexpectedly dropped into a calm, reflective pool. "Mr. Harrison." Joyce's surprised voice was barely more than a soft whisper, her wide eyes genuinely filled with palpable confusion and something that just might have honestly been real hope. Mitchell's ruddy face suddenly went quickly from bright red to deathly pale in a single shocking instant. "Sir, I sincerely didn't honestly know you were standing right here. I was honestly just carefully handling a purely personnel matter strictly according to established company policy." "Which specific company policy would that honestly be, Charles?" Robert's naturally calm voice was undeniably smooth, but there was a dangerous steel clearly underneath. The absurd policy that unreasonably punishes honest employees for openly showing simple kindness to paying customers, the truly terrible policy that mistakenly treats basic human compassion as active theft. The bustling cafe was suddenly so eerily quiet that Robert could clearly hear the nearby traffic bustling outside, the distant comforting hum of the busy espresso machine, and even the sound of his own anxious heartbeat. Joyce stood utterly frozen awkwardly between the two extremely different men, her noticeably pale face a confusing mixture of stark fear and genuine bewilderment. Robert confidently turned to directly address not just the clearly flustered Mitchell, but rather absolutely everyone in the entire cozy cafe, his hard-working employees who'd been quietly living out long-forgotten values, and the familiar customers who'd each been gently touched by countless small acts of everyday grace that had honestly never even remotely appeared anywhere in those dry, meaningless quarterly reports. "I've honestly been sitting right here for the past 2 days," he said sincerely, his naturally strong voice thoughtfully carrying to every quiet corner of the suddenly silent room. 2 full days, attentively watching exactly how this very place actually runs when I'm not personally around. And what I've personally seen has honestly been the absolute best education in effective leadership I've ever realistically received. He earnestly looked directly at the suddenly tearful Joyce, genuinely seeing her completely clearly for perhaps the very first time. "You've actively been giving away hot coffee to numerous people who truly need it, haven't you? Quietly covering small shortfalls with your own limited money because you honestly believe that basic human kindness realistically matters far more than soulless profit margins." Joyce deliberately nodded slowly, tears noticeably starting to form in her naturally kind eyes. "I honestly never meant to actively steal from you personally, Mr. Harrison. I simply couldn't readily stand silently by watching someone sadly walk entirely away disappointed when a single cup of genuinely hot coffee might be the best honestly good thing in their otherwise terrible day." "Steal from me?" Robert's strong voice gradually grew even stronger, noticeably more certain and completely secure. "Joyce, you've honestly been readily giving away something far more undeniably valuable than merely coffee. You've knowingly been freely giving away real hope, basic dignity, and authentic human connection. You've consistently been representing the absolute very best of exactly what this company was always meant to be." He confidently turned to face the increasingly nervous Mitchell, his typically kind expression suddenly hardening significantly. "You're officially fired, Charles. Effective immediately. A consistently terrible manager who cannot clearly recognize the obvious difference between simple theft and heartfelt generosity has absolutely no honest place working in my company." Mitchell's stunned mouth literally opened and then closed repeatedly like a suffocating fish completely out of desperately needed water. But sir, the established policies, the sacrosanct profit margins. The misguided policies are definitely changing right now, Robert said firmly. Starting today, the profound transformation happening in Robert was clearly visible to positively everyone attentively watching. This definitely wasn't just a detached CEO making a purely calculated business decision. This was undeniably a genuinely good man warmly remembering exactly who he'd originally meant to be all along. He knowingly addressed the entire suddenly silent cafe, his resonating voice warm with palpable emotion. My beloved grandmother personally started this relatively small business just over 60 long years ago with a simple, heartfelt belief that every single person deserved a safe place where they could always be treated with sincere kindness and unwavering respect. Somewhere tragically along the winding way, I undeniably lost sight of that very important ideal. But you all, he thoughtfully gestured warmly to the grateful Joyce, the relieved Tom, and the tearful Betty. You never honestly forgot. Joyce lovingly wiped the streaming tears from her red eyes. Your sincere grandmother honestly sounds like she was a uniquely wonderful woman. She honestly was, Robert said softly. And she would have absolutely loved each and every one of you. She honestly would have undoubtedly seen in you the very same special spirit that originally built this place. The familiar customers throughout the cozy cafe slowly began to happily smile, instinctively sensing that they were undoubtedly witnessing something truly special and undeniably transformational. Tom honestly looked like he might genuinely burst with intense happiness, and Betty was carefully dabbing at her overflowing eyes with a spare paper napkin. Robert casually pulled out his expensive phone and deliberately made a very important call that absolutely everyone could clearly hear. Legal department. This is actually Robert Harrison. I immediately need you to urgently draft a completely new company policy immediately. Effective at the close of business today, all cafe managers are hereby fully authorized to provide complimentary drinks and valuable food to sincere customers experiencing significant financial hardship. When he confidently hung up his phone, the entire cafe suddenly erupted in loud, sustained applause. Joyce was quietly crying openly now, but her readily flowing tears were purely joyful. Mr. Harrison, I honestly don't even know exactly what to say at all. Say you'll gladly help me personally rebuild this critically important company the exact warm way it was always rightfully meant to be. Robert quickly replied with genuine emotion. Say you'll honestly help me fully remember that the very most important honest numbers aren't passively sitting on boring spreadsheets. They are specifically the quantifiable number of people we sincerely help, the countless moments of heartfelt kindness we thoughtfully create, and the genuinely strong connections we diligently foster. If you've truly been enjoying this thoughtfully heartfelt story, please kindly subscribe to our growing channel for even more genuinely heartwarming tales that readily remind us exactly what truly matters most. As the familiar morning customers gradually returned slowly to their normal conversations, a noticeably new, genuinely positive energy immediately filled the suddenly buzzing cafe. It genuinely felt like the hopeful first day of something undeniably beautiful, not simply for the long-struggling business, but honestly for absolutely everyone who'd each been personally touched by this very unexpected moment of profound transformation. Robert intuitively knew that the genuinely hard work was honestly just barely beginning. But for honestly the very first time in literally years, he unexpectedly felt truly excited about the very near future. 6 short months later, Robert quietly sat thoughtfully at the very same familiar corner table where his own remarkable journey of unexpected discovery had originally begun. But everything had undeniably changed significantly. The once struggling cafe buzzed happily with the very same warm energy he clearly remembered, but now it readily felt deliberate, intentionally supported, and wholeheartedly celebrated rather than quietly hidden. The thoughtful community care policy he'd wisely implemented had been happily adopted across all 43 different locations, and the incredible stories of natural kindness that gratefully reached his personal desk each and every week happily filled him with significantly more tangible pride than even the best quarterly profit report ever honestly could. Joyce warmly approached with his usual expertly made coffee, but her own familiar appearance was thankfully transformed. New shoes, a naturally confident stride, and the unmistakable kind of beaming smile that clearly comes from honestly knowing that your hard work is readily valued and rightfully appreciated. She'd rightfully been promoted quickly to Regional Community Coordinator, a very important position Robert had thoughtfully created specifically to honestly spread the heartwarming culture of everyday caring that she'd always embodied so completely naturally. "The usual, Mr. Harrison?" she thoughtfully asked, but her familiar tone was now playful, radiating with the genuine friendship that had slowly grown warmly between the two of them gradually over the recent months. "Please, Joyce, we've obviously really been through this together." "It's definitely Robert when I'm sitting right here at your table," he immediately replied with a sincere grin. "And yes, the always delicious usual." Joyce's kind eyes notably lit up brightly as she expertly prepared his simple coffee. The familiar customers honestly love all the worthwhile new initiatives, and the incredibly touching stories we willingly get are honestly unbelievable. Betty's thoughtfully been putting up familiar photos and personal letters from each of them on the large community board. She warmly gestured thoughtfully toward. A corner wall was now plastered with pictures, thank you notes from grateful customers, and updates highlighting the various charitable endeavors the cafe had begun to champion. As Joyce delivered his coffee, Robert pondered how drastically his personal definition of success had transformed. The financial figures remained robust. Customer loyalty had soared since they'd launched the kindness initiatives. However, the metrics that now held the greatest significance for him were quite different. He focused on the sheer number of families who had benefited from programs enabling customers to purchase extra beverages for those facing financial hardship. He cherished the countless stories of individuals who had forged genuine friendships amongst the cafe's regulars. Tom practically bounced over, his enthusiasm undimmed despite his recent promotion to assistant manager. "Robert, you absolutely have to see this," he exclaimed, brandishing his phone screen. "Mrs. Patterson just posted about us on social media." Robert read the post aloud, his voice filled with emotion. "Harrison's Cafe isn't merely a coffee shop. It's living proof that there are still havens in this world where people genuinely care about one another. 6 months ago, I was navigating the darkest period of my life, and a kind waitress named Joyce made me feel like my existence mattered. Today, I'm thrilled to report that I'm thriving, and I continue to visit weekly because this place embodies the warmth and comfort of family." The post had already garnered dozens of comments from other patrons, sharing similar heartwarming stories of connection and support. Robert felt that familiar surge of warmth in his chest, the comforting sensation that always accompanied reading these heartfelt testimonials. This was the legacy he yearned to establish. Not merely successful commercial enterprises, but thriving communities where individuals felt genuinely valued and supported, places where they could truly belong. Betty materialized at his elbow, as she frequently did these days, having unofficially appointed herself as Robert's trusted advisor. At 72, she possessed a wealth of wisdom that perfectly complemented Robert's sharp business acumen. "You know what I admire most about all of this?" Betty asked, settling into the chair across from him with a contented sigh. "It's that you didn't simply revamp the policies. You underwent a profound personal transformation. The man who sits here week after week, sipping coffee and attentively listening to people's stories, is the very same individual who makes crucial decisions impacting people's livelihoods." Robert nodded thoughtfully, acknowledging the truth in her words. "I gleaned a valuable lesson from Joyce that very first day. She shared that her husband used to encourage her to actively seek out the good in ordinary moments, because that's where the real treasures are hidden. I'd been so singularly focused on extraordinary achievements that I was overlooking the extraordinary acts of kindness unfolding right before my eyes." Their conversation was pleasantly interrupted by the arrival of a young woman pushing a stroller. It was the same mother Robert had observed Joyce assisting 6 months prior, but now the woman radiated confidence, looked well-rested, and seemed genuinely happy. She waved to Joyce with obvious affection and gratitude. "How's little Jake doing?" Joyce called out, her voice filled with genuine warmth. "He's absolutely wonderful, thanks to you," the mother replied, her eyes sparkling with appreciation. "And I wanted to let you know that I landed the promotion at work. The interview practice you so generously provided here made all the difference." Moments like these unfolded daily now, and each one served to reinforce Robert's unwavering belief that he had made the right, albeit unconventional, choice. By empowering his employees to extend compassion and understanding to those they served, he'd set in motion a chain reaction of kindness that rippled far beyond the physical confines of his cafes. As the afternoon settled into its comfortable and familiar rhythm, Robert reflected on the 3 simple words that had irrevocably altered the course of his life. Not some dramatic declaration, as he might once have envisioned, but Joyce's unassuming statement, "People feel at home here." Those words had illuminated the path to true fulfillment, revealing that authentic success wasn't about constructing a vast empire. It was about cultivating spaces where people's lives were genuinely enriched, places where they felt seen, heard, and valued. The transformation hadn't been entirely without its challenges. Some investors had openly questioned the wisdom of the new policies, expressing concern over their potential impact on the bottom line. However, Robert had learned to respond with compelling anecdotes rather than relying solely on dry statistics, sharing first-hand accounts of how heightened customer loyalty and unwavering employee satisfaction had ultimately fueled sustainable success. As closing time drew near, Robert gathered his belongings, but not before taking a moment to chat with several of his regular customers and personally check in with his dedicated team. This evening ritual had quickly become one of his most cherished parts of the day. Joyce accompanied him to the door, as had become their established custom. "Same time tomorrow?" she inquired with a warm smile. "Wouldn't miss it for the world," Robert replied, his voice filled with genuine sincerity. "This is where I do my best thinking these days." As he stepped out into the cool evening air, Robert reflected on how profoundly his life had been reshaped. The ambitious executive who had once meticulously measured success in dollars and cents now measured it in the genuine smiles of his customers, in the fleeting yet meaningful moments of human connection, and in the deep-seated knowledge that his business was actively contributing to making the world a slightly kinder, more compassionate place. The 3 simple words that had once stopped him in his tracks, "People feel at home here," had evolved into something far greater than a mere observation about his cafe. They had become his personal mission statement, his constant reminder that the ultimate achievement in both business and in life lies in creating welcoming spaces where individuals feel truly valued, unconditionally supported, and deeply loved.